In the winter of 1890, somewhere in the North Woods, a teamster stood beside a road that was not really a road. It was a frozen track through the timber. At night, men had hauled water from a creek and poured it over the ruts until the whole trail turned into a strip of ice. By morning, the road was slick enough for horses to pull a load that would have been almost impossible on dirt. On the sled behind them sat white pine logs, stacked higher than a man could reach, each log cut by hand, trimmed by hand, rolled by hand, and dragged out of the woods before any truck could ever come for it. There were no diesel engines, no logging trucks, no hydraulic loaders, no paved forest roads running into the cut. Just snow, ice, horses, oxen, sled chains, iron shoes, cross-cut saws, axes, peavies, and men who understood that the easiest way to move a giant tree was to wait until the world froze solid. And here's the question most people never ask. Before trucks existed, how did America move millions of giant logs out of forests that had no real roads? Not one log, not one camp, but entire pine forests. Enough timber to build houses, barns, bridges, docks, mines, railroad ties, and whole towns across the country. The answer was not one invention. It was a system. First, men cut the trees in winter. Then animals dragged the logs to iced roads. Then loaded sleds carried them to river landings. Then spring flood water carried them toward the mills. And when the rivers were no longer enough, Americans built machines with 10-foot wheels and temporary railroads that disappeared almost as soon as the forest was gone. This is the story of how America moved giant logs before trucks existed. And it begins with a problem that was much larger than the trees themselves. The problem was distance. A pine tree standing in the woods had almost no value to a builder in Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Bangor, Bay City, or any other growing town until someone found a way to move it. This is the part modern eyes miss. We see lumber as a product. Boards stacked at a yard, 2x4s wrapped in plastic, plywood on a flatbed. But before that timber became a product, it was a tree standing in a remote place where there might not be a permanent road, a bridge, a settlement, or a mill within easy reach. The value was locked inside the forest. Cutting the tree was only the first key. Moving it was the real puzzle. And the puzzle had to be solved over and over again. Every winter, every camp, every new stand of pine. The lumber companies were not moving a few beautiful logs for a furniture maker. They were feeding a national appetite. Houses needed framing. Mines needed timbers. Railroads needed ties. Cities needed planks, beams, shingles, docks, crates, and scaffolding. A growing country was eating forests and turning them into towns. That is why the old logging system became so elaborate. It was not quaint. It was industrial logistics before modern roads. That sounds obvious now, because modern machinery has made distance feel smaller than it really is. Today, a logging crew can cut, lift, load, and haul timber with machines that put more power in one operator's hand than an entire 19th century camp could produce in a day. But in the old logging country, distance was everything. A tree could stand 10 miles from the nearest river, and that 10 miles might as well have been an ocean. The ground was uneven. The forest was full of stumps. There were bogs, ravines, frozen creeks, hillsides, and deadfall. In warm weather, wheels sank into mud, and teams exhausted themselves, pulling one load a few hundred yards. In deep forest, there were no roads in the modern sense. There were cut trails, skid roads, tote roads, winter tracks, and paths beaten into use by men and animals. But there was nothing like a highway system waiting for the lumber companies. So the old loggers made a strange decision. They turned winter into their machine. That is why logging camps in Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other northern timber states came alive when most farmers were trying to stay close to the stove. Winter froze the swamps. Winter hardened the ground. Winter let men build ice roads. Winter gave a sled runner less friction than any wagon wheel could dream of. And winter turned the forest into a temporary factory. The camp itself was usually thrown together fast. A bunkhouse, a cook shack, a stable, a blacksmith space if the camp was large enough. Men slept crowded together, sometimes more than 70 in a bunkhouse, with wet socks and pants hung overhead to dry, and smoke from the stove mixing with the smell of wool, hay mattresses, tobacco, horses, and frozen leather.
The work started before sunrise. The choppers went first. The whole day was organized around production because daylight in winter was short and the cost of keeping a camp alive was constant. Every man in the bunkhouse had to earn his place. The cook had to feed them before they went out. The teamsters had to have the animals harnessed. The blacksmith, if the camp had one, had to keep iron shoes, chains, sled parts, axes, and saws in working order. A broken chain on the road was not just an inconvenience. It could stop a load, block the grade, endanger a team, and waste the cold hours that made the road usable. The camp cook mattered more than outsiders imagined. A logging crew burned through food at a shocking rate because the work was cold, wet, and constant. Men in some camps ate as if they were fueling furnaces: beans, bread, potatoes, pork, pancakes, pies, coffee, and whatever else the cook could keep moving. The meal was not a social hour. It was part of the machine. Men came in, ate quickly, and went back out. A hungry camp slowed down. A bad cook could ruin morale faster than bad weather. There was no romantic separation between labor and survival. The food was part of the logging system. The horses were part of it. The bunkhouse was part of it. Even the wet socks hanging over the stove were part of it, because a man with frozen feet could not keep his saw moving. In the earlier years, axes did most of the falling. Later, two-man crosscut saws took over more of the work because they could bring down timber faster and cheaper. The men would notch the trunk with an axe, set the saw, and work the steel back and forth until the tree began to talk. Every large tree gives warning before it falls. It cracks. It shifts. It leans into the notch. Then the whole top begins to move, and every man nearby has only a few seconds to get clear before tons would come down through the branches. After the tree was down, other men limbed it. They cut away the branches, trimmed the top, and marked the log for ownership. In some operations, barkers or swampers cleared limbs and brush so teams could move. The forest floor became a mess of slash, chips, snow, and cut trunks waiting for the next stage. That next stage was called skidding. Skidding was the dirty middle step almost nobody thinks about. It was not glamorous. It was not fast, and it was where the forest fought back. The logs had to be dragged from the stump to a landing, a road, a riverbank, or later a railroad spur. Oxen or horses were hitched to the log with chains. The teamster walked with them, shouted commands, watched the line, watched the animals, watched the stump line, and try not to get crushed if the log swung sideways or caught on a buried root. A good teamster mattered as much as a good sawyer. He had to know when the animals were pulling too hard. He had to feel when the log was about to roll. He had to see a bad angle before the chain snapped or a horse went down. He did not move timber by brute force alone. He moved it by reading the ground. Once enough logs reached a landing, they were loaded onto sleds. And this is where winter did its real work. In Minnesota, logging country, old accounts describe dirt roads being turned into ice roads so that heavy sleds could carry enormous loads to the river. Some sources describe 20-ton sleighs moving over these frozen tracks. 20 tons does not sound like a sled load. It sounds like a rail car. But with iron runners on ice, a team could pull weight that would have been absurd in mud. The roads had to be maintained like machinery. At night, men spread water across the route. They used sprinkler tanks, barrels, sleds, anything that could carry water from a creek or pond. In bitter cold, the water froze hard before morning. The rough road became a shining track. During the day, the sleds moved. Chains tightened. Harness leather creaked. Horses leaned forward until their bodies were nearly parallel with the pull. The sled runners hissed on the ice. If the grade was wrong, the load could overrun the team. If the sled tipped, a pile of logs could come down like a collapsing wall. If a runner jumped the road, a man could be pinned before anyone had time to shout. This was the first machine in the old logging system. Not a machine made of iron, a machine made of weather. The forest was cut in winter because winter let the logs move. But the old system had a second machine, and it was much bigger: the river. For a logging company, a river was not scenery. It was transportation. In the 19th century, sawmills were often built on rivers because the same water could power the mill and carry the timber toward it. Pine was especially valuable not only because it was strong and workable, but because it floated well. That one fact shaped entire industries. The winter crews hauled logs to the banks of rivers and streams. They stacked them in great piles called landings or decks. The logs waited there through the cold, sometimes covered with snow, sometimes locked together in piles that looked as if the forest had been cut into pieces and stored for spring. Then the thaw came. Snow melted. The rivers rose. Streams that had been narrow and low became fast and swollen. And the river drivers arrived. If the winter lumberjack was a man of snow, axe, saw, and horse, the river driver was a man of water, balance, risk, and nerve. The drive had its own camp, too, but it moved. In some river systems, the drivers used a wanigan, a barge-like floating cook shack and bunkhouse that followed the drive downstream. It was the headquarters of a moving workplace. Food, bedding, tools, repairs, orders, and exhaustion all had to travel with the logs. The forest camp had been fixed in one place for the winter. The river camp followed the current. That was necessary because a drive could stretch for miles. Logs did not all move at the same speed. Some shot ahead in fast water. Some stranded in shallows. Some caught against rocks. Some tangled at bends. The crew had to keep the whole wooden mass from spreading, jamming, or getting lost. This was why the river drive was not just floating timber. It was herding timber. His job was to make thousands of individual logs behave like a moving herd. That is almost impossible to understand unless you picture what the river looked like. The logs did not float neatly in rows. They spun, rolled, jammed, slammed into rocks, caught on bends, piled against bridge piers, wedged in shallows, and built wooden dams out of themselves. The river wanted chaos. The drivers wanted motion. They stood on wet logs with corked boots, carried long pike poles and peavies, and stepped from one moving piece of timber to another while cold water rushed underneath them. A peavy looked simple, a wooden handle with a spike and a hinged hook. But in skilled hands, it was a steering wheel, a brake, a lever, a weapon against the jam, and sometimes the only thing between a man and the water. River drivers worked in crews. Some stayed ahead to guide the drive. Some stayed behind to free stranded logs. The most dangerous men were the ones sent into the jams. There were tools for all of it, and every tool had a purpose. The pike pole pushed and prodded from a distance. The peavey rolled and turned logs with its spike and hook. Cant hooks helped men twist timber on landings and in shallow water. Boom chains and floating booms helped gather logs into larger controlled masses near lakes or mills. Marks cut or stamped into logs told companies whose timber was whose, because a river drive could mix ownership the way a storm mixes leaves. When the logs finally reached a boom or mill pond, men still had to sort them, hold them, guide them, and feed them toward the saws. The river did not deliver neat lumber. It delivered a wet, battered, moving inventory problem. That is another thing modern machinery has hidden. Every system before trucks required handling the same log again and again. Cut it, limb it, skid it, deck it, load it, haul it, dump it, float it, free it, sort it, saw it. At each step, a man or an animal could be hurt. A log jam could begin with one trunk wedged against a rock, then another lodged against it, then 3 more, then 50, then hundreds of logs piled up behind the obstruction until the river itself began to rise against the wooden wall. To break a jam, someone had to find the key log, the one piece holding the pressure. Move the wrong log, and nothing happened. Move the right one, and the whole mass could explode. That is not a figure of speech. When a jam broke, the stored force of the river released at once. Logs that had been still a second earlier leapt forward, rolled over each other, shot downstream, and swallowed the place where the driver had been standing. This is where the old logging world stops being picturesque. It was deadly. One of the names still attached to that danger is William Haskell. In June of 1841, Haskell was 25 years old and working as a Maine lumberman near what is now remembered around Haskell Rock in the Kittadine region. He was helping break up a log jam when he drowned. His body was not recovered for 3 weeks. The place remembered him because the work killed him there. Picture what that means without making it cleaner than it was. A jam has formed around rock and current. The water is loud enough that men have to shout. Logs are pressed together so tightly that they look almost solid, but every one of them is waiting to move. Haskell is not standing on ground. He is working on timber that can roll under his boots, using a pole or a hook to search for the one piece that will let the river go. If he succeeds, the jam breaks. If he is still in the wrong place when it breaks, the same success can kill him. That is the trap of river driving. The moment the work finally gives way is also the moment the worker is in the greatest danger. We do not have a clean second-by-second account of Haskell's last movements, but we know enough to understand the shape of the death. A young lumberman went onto a jam. The jam, the river, or the timber took him under. For 3 weeks, his family and the men who knew that river did not have his body. There is not a clean, heroic painting in that fact. There is a young man in cold water. There is a body battered by river and timber. There is a grave near the place where the river took him. And there is a name that stayed on the map because the job was dangerous enough that people could not quite let the story disappear. If you're watching Built Before Machines for the first time, this is the kind of history this channel is here to tell. Not just the machines, not just the numbers, the people who put their bodies inside the work. Subscribe if you want more of these stories preserved before they vanish into footnotes. Haskell was not the only one. In the University of Maine's Maine Song and Story Sampler, there's a preserved wood song about a river driver named John Roberts. The notes matter more than the song itself for our purposes because they identify the death behind it. John Roberts drowned near Great Pond in Maine on April 22, 1859. He died while breaking a jam near a rolling dam on the Union River. His gravestone in Aurora, Maine, still carried the date when the record was described. The song says his body was found on the 3rd day. The archive is careful, as archives should be, to explain that songs can make symbols out of real events. But the death was real. That is the part to sit with, not the ballad. The man, Roberts hired out to help drive lumber downriver. He went onto a jam. The jam took him. And like many workers in dangerous trades, what survives is not a diary or a photograph or a long letter home. What survives is a name, a date, a river, a grave, and a song because the men who did that work understood exactly how easily any one of them could become the next verse. That is the kind of detail that makes an archive feel human. Not grand, not cinematic, human. Someone found the body. Someone sent the message. Someone made the beer. Someone remembered the name long enough for it to be sung. And decades later, people still had to explain which river the song really meant because every logging region had its own dead, its own jams, its own dangerous bends, and its own men who never came home. River driving demanded a strange mix of skill and bravado. The best drivers could run across rolling logs in current, plant a pole, twist a log, and leap away before the whole surface moved under them. Older men told stories about the one man brave enough or foolish enough to reach a certain jam. Those stories became part of lumber camp culture because the work itself had almost no margin for error. A man who fell into nearly freezing water had several ways to die. He could drown. He could be pulled under the drive. He could be crushed between logs. He could be trapped under a jam. He could reach shore and still be too cold to save. And yet the logs had to move, because every log stuck upstream was money sitting in the woods. Every delay threatened the mill. Every jam could back up the river and stop thousands of logs behind it. So the drivers went out again. That is the brutal logic of the old system. The forest had been cut. The logs had been hauled. The river was high. The mill was waiting. And men had to stand on the moving timber and persuade it to keep going. For a long time, this system worked because the best timber stood near water. The lumber companies cut along rivers first because rivers solved the transportation problem for free. The earliest Minnesota logging, for example, took place alongside rivers where both timber and water transport were available. Maine's 19th and early 20th century long logging operations also depended on winter cutting, animal-drawn sleds, and spring drives down rivers toward sawmills. But the old system had a limit. What happened when the best trees near the river were gone? What happened when the timber stood too far inland for oxen and sled roads alone to make sense? What happened when the forest could be cut faster than the river system could reach? That was the bottleneck. America could cut trees. America could float trees. What could not easily do was reach deeper and deeper into the forest without better ways to move logs over land. The first answer was still animal power, but in a new form. Big wheels. In Michigan logging country in the 1870s, one of the most important transport inventions was a device that looked almost too simple to matter. Two enormous wooden wheels, often around 10 feet high, connected by a heavy axle. Chains hung from the axle and lifted the front end of one or more logs off the ground. The inventor most often associated with these logging big wheels was Cyrus Overpack of Manistee, Michigan. The machine had other names in different places, and different makers produced their own versions, but the principle was beautifully direct. Lift the log, reduce the drag, get the front end off the ground. Let the wheels carry the worst of the friction. It was not trying to be elegant. It was trying to defeat stumps. The genius of the design was clearance. A normal drag log caught on stumps, roots, brush, and rough ground. But when the log was chained under a high axle, its front end lifted. The wheels rolled over uneven ground. The load did not plow into every obstacle. Oxen or horses pulled the wheels. The logs hung beneath. And suddenly logging did not depend quite so completely on snow and ice. This mattered because before big wheels, moving logs overland was heavily tied to winter. Ice roads made sled hauling efficient, but when the thaw came, the old roads softened. Mud swallowed wheels. Horses sank. The woods became a trap. Big wheels extended the season. They allowed logs to move across rough, cut-over land without waiting for perfect winter conditions. They did not replace the river. They did not replace the sled. They did not make the work easy. But they solved one of the old system's worst problems: how to skid heavy timber when the ground was no longer a frozen road. Picture a team pulling a pair of 10-foot wheels through a cut-over forest. The ground is scarred with stumps. The canopy is gone. Brush is everywhere. Chains creak under the axle. Behind the team, several logs swing slightly as the wheels roll forward. The driver has to keep the team steady because if the load swings, the whole rig can become dangerous. The wheels are taller than a man. The logs are heavy enough to kill anything they pin. The path is not smooth. It is a battlefield after the trees are down. And still, compared with dragging every log nose first through the dirt, the big wheels were a breakthrough. This is one of the things I love about old American work. The inventions were often strange because the problems were strange. Modern machinery hides the problem. The old machines revealed it. A stump puller looks bizarre because removing stumps by hand was a brutal mechanical problem. A log flume looks bizarre because moving timber down mountains was a brutal gravity problem. Big wheels look bizarre because dragging a tree across a stump field was a brutal friction problem. Built before machines is not just about what people built before modern equipment existed. It is about the weird, specific tools they invented because reality gave them no polite options. But even big wheels could only go so far. They moved logs short distances. They were useful from stump to landing. They helped bridge the gap between the cut and the road, or the cut and the rail, or the cut and the water. They did not solve the deeper transportation problem by themselves. For that, the lumber companies turned to railroads. Not grand passenger railroads. Not permanent lines meant to connect cities for generations. Logging railroads were different. They were temporary railroads into the woods. They were built to reach timber, strip a region, and then disappear. In Michigan, narrow-gauge logging railroads began proving themselves in the 1870s. One early example was tried in Clare County during the winter of 1876 to 1877 by Winfield Scott Garrish. The idea spread because it solved a problem that horses, sleds, and rivers could not solve forever. Rails could go inland. Rails could reach stands of timber that water could not. Rails could carry logs to mills, rivers, or larger railroads. Rails could keep moving even when the old river and sled geography had been exhausted. Minnesota's logging railroad era tells the story clearly. Before specialized logging railroads, Minnesota operations relied heavily on river transport, log drives, and boom operations. Camps were placed along major rivers and streams that fed into them. But as timber near water was depleted, companies needed new transport methods. The first logging railroad in Minnesota appeared in the mid-1880s near present-day Carleton. Over the following decades, more than 40 different logging railroads reached into northern pine stands. In all, nearly 5,000 miles of logging railroad were built across northern Minnesota. Think about that number. 5,000 miles. Not 5,000 miles of permanent empire. 5,000 miles of track pushed into forests where the track was only useful until the timber was gone. Some lines lasted only a few years. When the stand was cut out, the rails came up. The company moved. The forest changed from resource to stump field. And the railroad that had made the cut possible vanished in a memory, leaving grades that later became woods roads, trails, or faint lines in the land. The railroad changed the rhythm of logging. The cut logs could be skidded by oxen or horses to a rail landing. In earlier years, log cars might be loaded by manpower and teams. Later, steam loaders and jammers made loading faster and safer. Small locomotives, sometimes weighing 50 to 75 tons, hauled strings of log cars out of the woods. Those locomotives were not running through a clean industrial corridor. They were pushing into temporary country. The grades might be rough. The bridges might be timber structures built for use, not beauty. The track might cross frozen ground in winter and sink or shift when seasons changed. The whole line existed under a deadline written by the forest itself. Once the timber was gone, the railroad's reason for being was gone too. That made logging railroads one of the strangest forms of infrastructure in America. They were serious enough to require locomotives, cars, crews, grades, bridges, maintenance, and capital. But temporary enough that a few years later, a person could walk the old grade and see only brush, ties, rusted scraps, and a line through the trees that made sense only if you knew what had been there. This was no longer the old world of waiting entirely for spring floodwater. It was still dangerous, still temporary, still rough. But it was a different kind of power. Steam had entered the forest. Once railroads reached deep timber, the scale changed. Camps could be supplied more easily. Mail and newspapers reached workers more regularly. Fresh produce could come in. Injured men could get out faster than before. That last point matters because in a world of axes, saws, chains, horses, frozen roads, rolling logs, steam loaders, and rough medical care, injury was not an exception. It was part of the cost structure of the industry. The same railroad that carried logs could carry a wounded man away from the camp. That was progress. But progress did not make the forest gentle. It only changed the way the danger moved. With railroads, the timber frontier could go farther inland. With big wheels, logs could be moved in rougher seasons. With ice roads, winter loads could reach the landings. With rivers, spring could carry whole forests toward the mills. Put together, the system was astonishing. Not because any one piece was modern, because every piece depended on the others. The sawyers cut in winter because winter let the teamsters haul. The teamsters hauled to rivers because water could carry what roads could not. The river drivers risked their lives because the mills were waiting. The big wheels and logging railroads appeared because the riverside timber ran out. The entire system was an answer to one physical question. How do you move something too heavy for a man, too awkward for a wagon, too far from a mill, and too valuable to leave in the woods? Before trucks, the answer was use everything. Use cold, use animals, use gravity, use rivers, use iron wheels, use temporary rails, use men who knew how to balance on a moving log and men who knew how to keep a horse team alive on an ice grade, and use the fact that America needed wood badly enough to accept the cost. That need is hard to overstate. White pine helped build the Midwest and the prairie towns. It supplied houses, barns, bridges, ships, docks, mines, railroad ties, and factories. After the Great Chicago Fire, Michigan pine was part of the timber world that helped rebuild. In Minnesota, lumber production reached extraordinary scale. In the early 20th century, the state's lumbermen were cutting billions of board feet in a year. Those numbers are so large they almost stop meaning anything. So bring it back down. One tree, one axe, one saw, one team, one iced road, one river landing, one driver with a peavey in his hands, one man like William Haskell at a jam in 1841, one man like John Roberts at a rolling dam in 1859. That is what the big numbers were made of. The old lumber industry did not move forests because it had one perfect machine. It moved forests because it broke the impossible job into stages that human bodies, animals, weather, water, and temporary machines could each handle. And then, slowly, the system ended. Not all at once. Trucks did not appear on one Monday and erase a century of river driving by Friday. The change came unevenly. Road building expanded. Internal combustion engines improved. Railroads reached where they could. Modern logging equipment arrived later. Water pollution became harder to ignore. Rivers that had once been treated as timber highways came to be seen as ecosystems, recreation spaces, drinking water sources, and public places. In Minnesota, the last log drive took place on the Little Fork River in 1937. In Maine, the last Kennebec River log drive came much later, in 1976, ending a tradition that had lasted for generations. Men who had worked those final drives remembered them with a strange mixture of pride and loss, because to them, it had not been an old-fashioned spectacle. It had been work, hard work, dangerous work, work they knew how to do. One of those late memories came from David Calder, who worked on the Kennebec Drive in the 1960s and remembered hauling pulpwood from a huge jam in fast water behind a mill. At the end of the day, exhausted and trying to climb back up the bank, he said an older man named Ernest Kramer reached down, pulled him up, and told him he would eat his beans and johnny cake that night. That is not a sentence from the 1850s. That was living memory in the 20th century. The old river work did not vanish because people forgot how to do it. It vanished because the world around it changed. When trucks took over, they did not just replace a transport method. They changed the entire geography of logging. A truck road could go where the river did not. A load could go directly to a mill. Crews no longer had to organize the year around winter roads and spring drives in the same old way. The camp system faded. The river driver disappeared. The wanigan, the floating cookhouse and bunkhouse of the drive, became museum memory. The old PV became an artifact. The ice road became a story. And many of the men who had made the system work became names that were never written down at all. That is the part one want to be careful with. It is easy to make old logging sound romantic. The snow, the horses, the camp stove, the river, the songs, the huge logs floating toward the mill. All of that was real, but so was the exhaustion. So were the crowded bunkhouses. So were the bodies in the water. So were the animals straining against loads no animal should have to pull. So were the forests cut so completely that the railroads were pulled up when there was nothing left to haul. This was not a clean story. It was an American building story. And American building stories are rarely clean. Before trucks existed, giant logs moved because men built a seasonal machine out of the landscape. In winter, the forest froze and became a road. In spring, the rivers rose and became a highway. In rough ground, big wheels lifted logs over stumps. In deeper timber, temporary railroads pushed iron into the woods. And through all of it, men walked beside teams, rode sled loads, balanced on floating timber, broke jams, loaded cars, cooked for camps, sharpened saws, and tried to survive long enough to spend the wages they had earned. The next time you see an old photograph of a lumber camp, do not just look at the trees. Look for the system, the sled road, the landing, the riverbank, the PVs in the men's hands, the horses standing in harness, the rail spur behind the mill, the enormous wheels that look like they belong in some forgotten medieval machine, but were actually solving a very specific American problem. And then ask the question again. How did America move giant logs before trucks existed? The answer is that it did not move them easily. It moved them with winter, with water, with animals, with temporary railroads, with strange machines, and with men whose names mostly disappeared, even though the houses, towns, railroads, factories, and farms built from that timber did not. If someone in your family worked in the woods, drove logs, ran horses, worked a sawmill, or remember stories from the old logging country, tell me in the comments. Write the name if you know it. Write the river if your family remembers one. Write the camp, the mill, the county, or even just the state. Because this channel is called Built Before Machines, but the machines are only half the story. The other half is the people who stood in front of impossible work and found a way to move it.